Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is a fantastic turnout. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to see so many new faces, so many returning faces. So from all of us at the History Center, thank you for attending this program. We've got a very exciting one for you all tonight with some incredible guest speakers. So my name is George Sagayev. I'm the head of programs here at the History Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's panel discussion and temporary exhibition opening for 38 miles north and south from Chicago, a comparative look at African American experience in Lake Forest and Joliet. So this program will be a 45-minute panel discussion, conversation moderated by the History Center's Executive Director, Carol Summerfield, along with a number of distinguished guests. And this exhibit opening and this program are all part of our current exhibition, Deeply Rooted and Rising High, African American Experience in Lake Forest. And then this is only one of the programs that we've done in supplementation of this exhibition run. We've got programs focused on architecture, local history, and a bunch of other topics. So the best way to keep up to date with that is to sign up for our newsletter, which is on the front desk at the front there, or check our website, lflbhistory.org, to stay up to date with all the programs and all the exciting things we're doing here at the History Center. And I wanted to say a special thank you to all of the members in the crowd today. It is through our membership that programs like these remain free and open to the public for everyone to enjoy. With all of that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator and the Executive Director of the History Center, Carol Summerfield.
Thank you all very much for coming, and I'd like to introduce our panel and then give you a little bit of background about how we got to this point. So Dennis Cremin, Professor Dennis Cremin from Lewis University, and I have known each other for weeks now. We worked on the Encyclopedia of Chicago together in the previous century, and have maintained our partnership along the way, working on various historical projects. It's been a fabulous partnership, and next to him is Morgan Jennings, who is his senior intern who worked on the African American voices from Joliet South End that is on display there. And then most of you know Dr. Courtney Joseph, who has been an amazing partner in developing our exhibition and just overall, over the course of the last 2 years, helping us bring forward a better depth and breadth of the stories that we tell here at the museum. And then at the end, another amazing contributor to this project, Sue Lawson, who is a filmmaker who also has a family history of more than 100 years in Lake Forest and was a significant contributor to the stories that are in our exhibit. So Dennis and I have been chatting about sort of the need for museums to make sure that they are more comprehensive in the stories they tell. And that background of Chicago history is sort of an interesting place to start because most of the area's history is Chicago, and then things around Chicago. And one of the things that became really clear as he was working on his exhibition and we were working on ours was the people who came to Lake Forest and Joliet skipped Chicago entirely. They didn't go to Chicago and then as an afterthought end up somewhere else. And so how do we bring that narrative into play? How do we help people understand why here? And how does that change over time? And what has that experience been like? And then what we really wanted to explore with this combined exhibition is how did it differ and how was it the same? And so with that, I'm going to give it to Dennis, and he can give you a little bit of background on how their exhibition came to be, and then we'll launch into just a very freewheeling conversation about this.
Thank you, Carol. Our exhibition came out of a grant opportunity from the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation that were talking about reclaiming the narrative. And it was centered on African American communities. Lewis University is in Romeoville, Illinois. It's just to the north of Joliet. Lewis had already been in partnership with a number of organizations, Warren Sharp Community Center and Second Baptist. And so it became this opportunity to go to them and say, what stories would you want to tell? And so the point was to digitize collections, go to their sites over the summer and see what they would bring out, and we would digitize them, and they're on the library website. And then the other part was this kind of public programs aspect where we did the banner exhibit that kind of reflected that experience. And again, the story is in the strain of American history in terms of African American history, but it's also distinct enough. And I think those are things that we investigated.
And then, Courtney, our partnership really focused on where Lake Forest and Lake Forest College came together and drifted apart in terms of this history. And can you tell us a little bit about the exploration that you've been through over the last couple of years in looking at Lake Forest College's African American experience?
Of course. So as I was telling Sue when we were starting, this project largely found me, I think, which is kind of the best, I think, sort of research sometimes. I had been teaching at Lake Forest College for a few years as one of the only Black faculty members, and we were interested in elevating and making the African American Studies program into a department. And through that process, started to do research on the African American experience at Lake Forest, really starting with the first Black graduate who in 1907 was a Black man named William Payton, now Dr. William Payton, because he's got an honorary degree, an honorary doctorate from the college. So from there, it's been an interesting thing to think about the ways that people often think about Lake Forest. I think in one of my classes recently, my students just asked me, so Lake Forest was a sundown town, wasn't it? Oh, for those of you who didn't know, I just get right into things. It's gonna be a good night. So I was like, no, actually, it was not a sundown town. And so we start to think about the complexities of what does a space that typically is represented not just in the town but in the school as predominantly white, largely white, but then when you start to peel back the layers, what are kind of the intricacies of a Black experiences, and it seems like the experience on the college at some points matches, but then drifts away from the story of the town, and that while it seems like the population of African Americans in Lake Forest, the town drops over time, especially in the late 20th century, mid to late. That's when the college starts to do an uptick of African American representation. So kind of what does that mean? How does that look? Where do those students come from? And then, you know, expanding to thinking about faculty and staff, et cetera, et cetera.
Excellent. Okay, and Sue, you come at this from two different angles. Personal history, and then the work you're doing on this documentary, and has now expanded, correct, into telling this experience of 120 years of African American presence in Lake Forest. Talk a little about some of the things that you have found in the course of the last couple of years, both personally and then in this narrative that you're developing.
I think one of the most interesting things to me is the reaction that people are having, not just the people who are originally from Lake Forest, but the people who came to Lake Forest. Because there are African Americans who came here after the Great Migration, and their impression of Lake Forest, what they were expecting it to be and what it is, sometimes matches up and is sometimes totally different. So those perceptions are one of the things that I like to go ahead and take a look at. In addition to that, I like, and I've expanded even more now, to the extent that we're not just taking a look at African Americans in Lake Forest, the fact that they did exist, they do exist, and their contribution to society here, and their personal experiences here, but we're looking at that comparatively with the rest of the world. We're kind of a little microcosm here. And one of the things I was telling Courtney beforehand was learning when you go away from here. I grew up in Lake Forest. And when you go away to school, you start to learn that, oh, the rest of the world is not quite like Lake Forest. And there are a number of people that we've done preliminary interviews with who have stated the same thing. And they have learned that, oh, it's totally different when we go out into the regular world and how we are perceived and how we are treated. And trying to take a look at their successes and their challenges, and just doing a comparative analysis of what life, for example, was like here in Lake Forest for African Americans during the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's fascinating. You'll enjoy it. It's fascinating.
Excellent. And so, Morgan, in the process of researching this history, you've had to really get in and talk to the folks who helped build some of the institutions in Joliet. Talk a little about what you found the Joliet experience was for the African Americans who've lived there, and were there surprises and were there things that were highly predictable?
I think going into the project first, I kind of had a perception of what I believe Joliet to be. I had come from a similar area, like it's mostly black, and so going into there, I kind of felt at ease. And then hearing the partners, like who we worked with, talk more and more, I was like, oh wait, no, this isn't the experience I've grew up in. This is more like a city experience. So like my family's from the South Side, and it's like very similar to there, just like, you know, these affluent areas that, you know, experience heavy amounts of white flight. And yet you still see community structures that try to persist through there. They're largely older. But it was interesting to see just how strong those connections still were, especially with the school. And, you know, it'd be funny because I'd go talk with like the partners on one day and then go to an event at my like school the next. And then I'd see them. I'm like, oh, you guys are here. They're like, yeah, we're always at Lewis, you know. And so it was just interesting seeing how much they put into their community to try to, you know, sustain it and to some extent reinvigorate it. I think that was the biggest surprise. I was just like, you know, seeing Joliet outside of, you know, once you leave that main city area and go into like the like South End, is which they called it, you know, you see a whole different Joliet than the Joliet that some people who are from, you know, the West Side talk about.
Excellent. So one of the things when we were going after grants, one of the things that was really important for both of these exhibitions was to talk about asset-based communities. And so for those of you who don't spend 400 hours a week in history, what that means is we've had a tendency to tell narratives over the course of the past, 100 years that are just like, oh, these poor people. Right, this is what we did to them. And one of the things about asset-based narratives is that we talk about what communities were able to do for themselves. And one of the most interesting parallels, I think, between these two communities was how much sort of self-actualization there was in community building, community organizing, developing cultural centers, developing institutions that created support within the communities. Each community had very different needs, but they both responded the same way, which is to create sort of a self-empowered community. And Dennis, if you could talk a little about how that fueled where you went with the exhibit, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think thinking about Morgan's comment about the particular partners, Warren Sharp Community Center is known as the Black Y, as in YMCA, Young Christian organization, so kind of a gym. I saw it as a very old building that was barely hanging on, very proud of their community garden, but incredibly under-resourced. And I think they're serving their community in a front-line way in terms of, we were talking about students coming in after school and just saying, we're hungry, and we'll make you a sandwich. That was the part that I think I wasn't ready for, that they had chosen to stay active in the community because they'd been active in the civil rights movement. This was one of the first employers in the town for young African American men and women, and that ultimately that work continues to this day.
In parallel then, in Lake Forest, and we heard this in some of the interviews that you did, there wasn't as much sort of essential need out of the community where they had to build those kind of clubs, but there were cultural needs. And so talk a little about the stories of the speakeasies and some of the other clubs that your family entertained yourself at.
There were a number of clubs that were strictly, I don't want to say strictly for African Americans, because as I understand that, they may have been created by and for African Americans, but if, for example, Nat King Cole was in town and stopped at the speakeasy, to go ahead, have a bite to eat, which was actually in the basement of someone's house. And it was a surprise to me because it was kind of kitty corner from the house that my sister and I grew up in. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, a speakeasy that close to home? My grandparents were temperance people. So how they let that happen is beyond me. But other people, the white population, would also show up. Because who didn't want to have an opportunity to see one of these performers, whether or not it was Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, whoever happened to be there at the time? That was a major experience for them. So we had clubs like that. We had a African American chapter of the Boy Scouts that was started actually by my grandfather here, because I don't want to say, though I'm sure it was true, that African Americans were not necessarily welcome in the major chapter of the Boy Scouts at that time here in town, but there was a need, there was a desire for them to have the same thing, so that was created for them. So we had clubs, we had social clubs, we had speakeasies, we had things like the Jack and Jill organization, which I believe is still around.
Yeah, they meet here,
Yes.
the museum.
Ah, there you go. The Mr. and Mrs. Club, which was, again, a social club. And they did a number of things. They would go on trips and excursions and golf outings and things. So while the society here in Lake Forest had the things that they were doing, the Amwinsia Club, etc., Lake Forest Club, the African Americans had their own social activities as well that were, I don't want to say relegated to people's basements, but they did not necessarily have a clubhouse, a hall for those things, but they made do and had a great time doing it.
A lot of this thrives in Lake Forest, starting in the 19-teens and runs really until the 1950s. But the parallel story at Lake Forest College is the opposite. Like, this becomes just the nadir of African American attendance. There's zero, right, between 1917 and 1954, as far as we know.
Until the 40s, mid-40s. So we know that the first African-American student graduates from Louisville, Kentucky. Why he came to Lake Forest, we're still trying to figure that out, but it seems like there was incentive, there was some sort of marketing kind of in Kentucky and in some of the upper South areas of kind of like, do you want to send your kid to like a cool liberal arts college that maybe is like near Chicago, but like, you know, somewhere else, and that's kind of the like marketing of the college. And we think at some point, because he's from a well-connected family, that is why he ends up at Lake Forest. He graduates in 1907, and then there are no black students, at least, who graduate until the 1940s. So there's just virtually zero black presence at the college for many decades. And one would think, again, that after William Payton was so excellent and like graduated with chemistry and played all these sports, one would imagine that that would have continued, but it didn't. And my students looked through the yearbooks and tried to find, and we did our best, but it wasn't until the 1940s into the 1950s that we start to see black students attend and graduate again. And then from there, it's like the 1960s is really the like peak of enrollment of African Americans. That's also then when you start to see more and more representation on the faculty and staff and admin side as well. So the students come first, and then you start to see, although there's a football coach that's here for a while, for decades actually, he's in the exhibit as well. We don't know exactly, again, why, because it sounds like, again, there's representation and stuff happening in the town, so what's happening at the college? Unfortunately, we have tons of examples and tons of, archival documents that point to a focus on minstrel shows being a popular both social and fundraising event for the college in the years that there were no black students. And so it's not as though there's like just a turnoff totally towards discussion of blackness, but it's often then through a very stereotypical lens. If you're not aware of what a minstrel show is, they're the blackface performances of caricatures of African American people that are increasingly popular in the post-Civil War period in the United States. We are no different in that way. I mean, some of your faves, including Judy Garland, were in blackface at some point. So some of your faves might now still do this for Halloween. Shout out to now. Don't color your face on Halloween. Tell all your friends.
Right, unless you're blue and you're an avatar.
Right, like, come on, man. So, anywho, that is like a really interesting thing about then how blackness is represented, but not by black people. That takes some time again. And then in the 60s is when you start to see much more of that.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, one of the parallels between the two communities is the black community builds in right about the same window of time. It's right as we're coming into the Civil War. We saw this town is founded in 1861. You start to see the first black residents within 10 years, and they make the trip up from the south after the war is over, either up through the Mississippi and through St. Louis, or directly out of Kansas, or not Kansas, Kentucky, the other K-state. And Joliet experiences a similar thing. And so that early settlement, talk to me a little about what that was like. And then I'd like Morgan, after Dennis talks about that, to talk about the importance of the 60s in Joliet's development, because I think that that's another pivotal moment for the town.
People had Joliet as a destination, and again, but the presence of systemic racism that they found in Joliet was real, and that life in the South End was going to be different than the west side of the city or the north. But again, people coming largely from southern states up. Joliet's a rail hub, so it's not only on the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which closes in 1909 in that area, but it's a railroad hub, and it's a way not to go into Chicago on the rails. And so that accounts for a fair amount of this, and like all of these things, it feels like chain migration. Somebody knows somebody who moved there, and they move into the neighborhood.
Just to speak on that Great Migration thing, it was interesting because we started the project as this long history, and then Dr. Cremin's like, okay, well this needs to be readable, so let's reel it back a bit. But it was interesting to see that so the first organization that comes up is the Second Baptist Church, end of the 1800s, and it forms because they're not allowed to go on the other side of the railroad where the Italians are, and so they form their own little community that's kind of self-sustaining, and the church serves as the hub of all the services needed for the community. Then we go on to the 70s, then we get, or 40s, 70s, and then the 70s is the peak, and we get Mount Zion Baptist Church. And they kind of serve the growing community who has even less money, who moves on the other side of the railway tracks into this almost unincorporated area. And then from there, we get Warren Sharp and the National Hookup of Black Women. So it's interesting that even after, it's like the second Great Migration. So the first one with Second Baptist, second one with Mount Zion, we're seeing this growing community that's adapting to their needs. And then that kind of leads us to the 60s, which is where it's interesting because two of our partners who are married, they come from Washington. And so they talk about their experience actually meeting Dr. King, and on the day he got shot, and I think Mr. Woods at is it Morehouse? Howard. So he's at Howard, and he comes to get his wife who's on campus in Maryland, and they all have to drive all the students before nightfall because the mayor's like, we're not allowing any black students on campus because there's going to be riots. And then we hear the partners from Joliet who are like, yeah, there were riots here, and the police contained it to that south end of Joliet where, unfortunately, there were some destruction of the black-owned businesses there. So now you have an almost decimated area in which you're stuck, and the partners say, it was a time, we were upset, we were angry, we wanted answers, and we knew it wasn't going to come from the outside, so it's another instance of them looking inwards to, rebuild and sustain themselves.
So Sue, do you want to talk a little about what the 60s were like here in the interviews that you're experiencing? And then Courtney, if you can talk about what we're finding on campus also takes place during this window, because it's an interesting window of time.
It's a dichotomy. It truly is, because here in Lake Forest, and I hate to admit it, but I was alive then.
She was a baby, though, diapers, no memory of that.
So I hear from my sources. The interesting thing was, it seemed as though it was, at least through a child's eyes, just business as usual. At the time when there are protests going on, the lunch counter, the Woolworths lunch counter down south, here, my aunt is taking us to the local Woolworths, which had the best club sandwiches around still. And you're sitting there, and it's not a protest. You are just going there for lunch. Lake Forest was a different type of environment to be in. I understand through the research that we've been doing that there was certainly rioting and unrest going on around us. Waukegan, other areas that had a higher percentage, if you will, of African Americans, there was civil unrest. Here, people went to work, people went to the grocery stores, and it was just another day. You watched the protests on TV, you read them in the newspaper, but you were not experiencing them firsthand in any way, shape, or form. I find that to be an interesting, just a totally different way of doing things. I'm going to fast forward for a moment before going to you. I will fast forward for a moment to the George Floyd protests. Yeah, it'll be a great segue for you that happened up here in Market Square. It was, I believe it was organized by students, and it was certainly very, very low-key. Absolutely. And yet, the stores in town, just so irritating that they felt the need to board up their windows. I looked at that as being a slap in the face, to be honest. It's like, let's go ahead. We need to be prepared. We know that there's going to be rioting. When has there ever been rioting in Lake Forest? The people who live here, the residents of Lake Forest, especially the longtime residents, we take pride in our property. We take pride in ourselves. And rioting is not the way that we express our displeasure. We do it through voting. We do it maybe through letter writing. We do it from
petitions.
within the system, petitions,
Yeah.
exactly. But we don't do it through, hey, let's throw a brick through Williams and Sonoma window. Oh my goodness, exactly. So here again we have a huge difference between here and even just other parts of the country. In fact, I'll just say other parts of the state. I don't know about Joliet, and you will go ahead and talk more about Lake Forest, but even when the Bulls were winning all those championships, down in Chicago, we're going to have rioting because we're happy. I don't understand that. Don't understand that at all. I too was happy that they won, but turning over a car, lighting something on fire, that's not Lake Forest style.
It's like a bubble in a bubble. I think that the stuff we're finding in the 1960s, and I think Tabby is here back there, who did a lot of this research with me over the summer, always citing my sources. So the 60s, again, are this kind of boom in terms of Black representation on campus. I've talked to some folks who graduated at that time and, are talked about there being a large kind of Memphis connection at that point of a bunch of African Americans from the South coming to Lake Forest, and in particular Memphis. So there was like a moment where you could hear a lot of Memphis drawl around campus, which I think is really interesting. But we know from at least the stuff about Dr. King is that at some point we have evidence that he visited campus and likely stayed in Glen Rowan, which is a historic building on campus. That's typically where they have you when you're doing your interview to stay. So I like to say that Dr. King was who was haunting me that night, because that place got something. Dr. King was with me, Jesus. So I'm here, aren't I? So, so that then shows that there was this interesting connection of Dr. King to the space. And then in the newspapers that, in particular, is a Black student newspaper that's founded in the wake of Dr. King's assassination called the Black Rap. It's digitized, collection is available online, student run from about 1968 till about 1987. And then I think in the last few years, there's been an uptick of bringing it back. From the newspaper, I think it was where Tabitha found an article about a student expressing that in the wake of Dr. King's assassination on campus, while students, and especially the large number of Black students, largest at that point, were really, for lack of a better term, in their feelings, like many across the country, and were given, I think, like the day afterwards off on campus, like the Monday afterwards, for like a kind of bereavement and like moment of remembrance, that white students partied on South Campus. And I was like, that's South Campus? Over there? That's where they...
Right. This was also one of the old Black neighborhoods. There were 3 in Lake Forest, one of which was there, and as Lake Forest College expanded, that was one of the neighborhoods that got sort of subsumed by the college. So it was distasteful on multiple levels.
Multiple levels, especially since my colleague Rebecca Graff, has done some archaeology digs on that corner of Washington and what is that thing called? South Campus, but I think it's Maplewood, where there used to be a Black church there. So the imagery of that really spoke to like us and kind of what I think has become a trend, at least over time, not through the research, but even in my experiences of kind of like 2 different experiences of the college even, that's then dichotomous from the experience of the folks in the town. So it's like how in this one small space are kind of people moving in very different ways. The thing that you brought up, it made me think of that, the response. I was here when George Floyd was murdered and they were, asking for folks to go. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, who's gonna bring a brick and throw it in and get some Lululemon leggings and a latte and before the protest? Who, girl? I just was so confused. This is not the space for that.
We're gonna use the Le Creuset, yeah.
So I think there's also like a weird misunderstanding of even like within the town of its own history, and like that's no shade. I think a lot of places are like this, for obvious reasons, but there's not a real connection to who the people are who are in Lake Forest who would even have never done anything like that. And even then, again, taking it back to 68, it wasn't the Black students on campus who were rioting, it was the white students who were having raucous parties. Yeah. So, that same sort of like, what is the like focus and why, I think was interesting.
If I may, it seems to me, and it's just my my personal opinion on it, I think that people who are anticipating the worst, if you will, are the ones who are not from the area to begin with. I think that the longtime residents, the native Lake Foresters, there's always been an understanding between people. I think that people have always pretty much gotten along here. And when other people come into town, they are bringing their preconceived notions and quite possibly their life experiences of what things were like where they were from. And when they come here, they're just kind of projecting that thought on everybody else. The first time that I was walking into one of the stores here in Lake Forest and a woman moved her purse, I was in shock because that had never, ever happened to me before. And all I could think of, and I was, I know I was in college at the time and was home for a vacation, all I could think of was, she's not from here. Because if she was, there'd be a hi. You didn't have to know each other. You just talk to people, hi, how are you? And you go your merry ways. But for her to physically move that purse to the other side, it was a shock to my system.
Lake Forest has a really interesting sort of historical narrative, the arc on the story of the African Americans in Lake Forest was not one I expected. And, you get early settlement here pretty much simultaneous with the first white settlers after the city is founded in 1861. There is a black church. The AME church is here by, I think, 1890. The First Baptist Church, the first black Baptist church in Lake County, is still here right outside of the downtown area. Yeah, there are lots of businesses, and one of the most striking things, and we're actually going to do a presentation on this in November, is that they were frequented by people of all colors. So a black business or a white business, there were not, as far as we've ever been able to find, any restrictions at all. Now, if you were a woman, that was a different story. 1920, don't be walking in if you need to use cash. You have to have daddy sign an account, and you have to be able to use that in order to buy things. But in terms of racial division, there were some social sort of parameters, but for the most part, it did not seem to have any level of the sort of restrictions you see in Joliet for decades and decades, really until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, there is a sort of shutdown that takes place in Lake Forest, but again, what it seems to be is driven economically, that it is in the wave of this sort of celebratory growth of the middle class, and you've got union wages putting people into a place where they can go buy a home anywhere. The suburbs are really a desirable place, and for everyone. And Lake Forest makes the decision, both the government and then the business district, they do not want to be middle class, and they start putting in restrictions around, like, you can't own a house if it's on anything less than an acre of land. And all of a sudden, there's all these other barriers that become inadvertently restrictive for new minorities, African Americans, and other groups that have migrated into Chicago to actually settle here. And that lasts. And so when you're talking about people who are new here, by the way, Lake Forest version of new, 40 years. So one of the things that does come about with that is, like 1 in 9 households in the last 10 years has changed hands in Lake Forest. There are new people. And so when we were building this exhibit, we had people come in and say, there are black people in Lake Forest? I'm like, yeah, 120 years of it. And this was one of the interesting things when we were looking at Joliet, is that I think Joliet is sort of the model everybody expects America to have been. And I will pass this to Dennis.
Yeah, I think the thing that we were looking at was Will County had African Americans in it from the beginning. And that Joliet very early on had a large African American population. I think that the thing that stood out to me was the King riots devastated the South End. And then it got compounded with Caterpillar leaving Joliet and the deindustrialization. I kind of joke, usually it's Detroit for me, but Joliet was at least one notch over from the belt buckle for the Rust Belt. And so it all happened at the same time, and it's hard to separate those things out in terms of, is it because of segregation, and because that's really the model that's going on here. Do you want to talk a little bit about when the Congresswoman Underwood came and visited in terms of her message? Or I'll just answer the question. She came in and she was like, it is by design. Going to the south end of Joliet is not a mistake. It is intentional, the way it looks. And I think that's far more of what people would be looking for.
Right, I think this is the general expectation. And again, sundown towns, man, we were surrounded by them. After dark, you were not black and on the streets in these towns. I did a conference with a bunch of the Kane County museums, and they wanted, based on what we were doing, they wanted to be able to do this for themselves. And what they found was, oh no, there were a whole lot of Klan gatherings west of the Fox River. Like, it was not a nice place to be. And Dennis and Courtney, you can talk about 1830 Illinois, not exactly what you'd think the land of Lincoln was going to be.
Well, I think oftentimes we think land of Lincoln and there's going to be no problem with slavery here. And it's like, wait, Dred Scott is 1857, 58. And he is traveling with a doctor from Missouri. He's traveling around Illinois and he says, well, then that makes me free, right? And the Supreme Court says, no, you're not free. And there is a lot of capturing of slaves, but they're not making a difference between who had been enslaved or who had been freed. And so Illinois has a really tough history with this, and the 19th century in particular.
They pass a law, and I think it is in the late 1830s, that basically says you are a criminal if you house a runaway slave, and you have to repatriate them back across the line. And this is not a state that is friendly to anyone who has made their way. Now, do we have an underground railroad? Do we have stops? Yes, we do along the way, but it was not a safe haven by any means. And so you don't see settlement up here really until the war.
Yeah, the very popular narrative of Illinois being the land of Lincoln is also tied to the fantasy of Lincoln being an abolitionist who freed the slaves because that's how he felt in his heart. That's not what happened. I think to me a more beautiful story to tell about Lincoln is that he is somebody who learns what it looks like to potentially be anti-racist. He is pushed there, thanks to people like Frederick Douglass and others, to really examine like what healing the country would actually have to mean. And then as much as he tried to do everything else, he realizes that, ending slavery is going to be the thing. But he also knew that it would be very hard to have a racially integrated society. And I mean, we're still contending with that to this day. So, in terms of, some of the earliest laws in Illinois include, like, you can live in Illinois if you're black, but they could whip you until you left. That doesn't sound fun. Little weird things like that give indication again that this is not a place of necessarily freedom. And in particular, the Dred Scott thing reminds us of something I was talking to my students about earlier, that just because you're not enslaved in the antebellum era in the United States, being black and free doesn't mean anything. You're still unfree. It's still second-class citizenship. You're still in a precarious situation. You could be taken at any moment. So there's no such thing as black freedom it was a larger question I just got myself into. But, there's not even what that, you couldn't just live freely as a black person in Illinois at any point in the 1800s either. That takes time, and that is why Chicago becomes such a important story, is because that is the city first again settled by a man of African descent, but then becomes such a hub for African American migration in the 20th century.
There is a story, and I don't know the veracity of it, so Carol and Courtney, I am going to turn to you to ask the truth of it. There is a rumor going around, or at least through the conversations that we've had, that one of the things about Lake Forest in the early days, there were never any addresses necessarily for people. And supposedly, that was also by design, because if people came up, for example, looking for what they perceived to be a runaway slave, they couldn't go to so-and-so's house because they didn't know where that was. And if you weren't from here, you had no idea where to go. And the locals were not inclined to go ahead and say, well, here's the Armour estate, let me take you there.
Yeah, for a bunch of reasons, but one of the effects of that was, if you needed to ask, you did not belong there. And so there was this idea of a very insular community where they watched out for each other. And that was one of the things. So the second police officer on the force in Lake Forest is an African-American man. So there's a white guy and there's a black guy basically policing this town. And part of it was so that they were able to keep an equal balance within these communities so that if things got out of hand, somebody could go talk to whoever needed to be talked to. And there was apparently one of the black men in, I think it's 1902, who was a regular drunk who would regularly get in the wrong car after being at the bar. And they finally were like, talk to him. Like, this is alarming women, he's getting in their car. And so, but that was sort of the way it was navigated. And so it is this really interesting story around the structural aspects of Lake Forest that allowed for this community to develop. And I'll make one more point, and then we're going to open it up to the public for questions, to the audience. One of the things, as we sort of look at this history, that's so fascinating to me is, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to do the exhibit, besides just expanding to stories we really should have been telling all along, it's that in Lake Forest, access to owning a business, owning a home, and quality public education was all it took to move a population that came out of slavery into the middle class and into the upper middle class within 2 generations. That was it. And you imagine what America would have been like if we had just all been like that, right? And it's interesting that these stories get buried, that there were these microcosms where it did happen, and it is a demonstration of success. And, it's important even within Lake Forest now to tell this story because so many new Lake Foresters do not know this. And it's unfortunate because there are aspects to the community that then pay the price because they're not aware of the fact that that was really all it took. And with that, we will open it up to the audience. I will jog.
This is more specifically for Dr. J. Why do you think there was such a gap between the first graduate and then later on into the 60s?
That's a good question that we've been kind of like mulling about what was happening. And so we just kind of reporting to or thinking about the larger climate. The 1910 to 1940 period is a very aggressively racist time in general, right? And so the possibility of then, like, this is a high time of Jim Crow segregation and not allowing black students into, schools. A school would have to have said they were desegregated, and integrated, and I don't think that was, like, part of the marketing message at the time, right? And then there's also, like, would a black student want to come here knowing that they're one of the only, if not the only, and what that experience is going to look like for them. So this is an era where more black students at least are going to go to HBCUs, historically black colleges or universities, than to decide to integrate, because integration is a difficult thing to do. I think it is often kind of imagined and romanticized, like many things, like the Jackie Robinson story of like, oh, well then, this one black person just like did it and like paved the way, and they had people were mean to them, but they rose above. And Jackie Robinson got like a lot of violence meted against him. I mean, by the time he retires, he is fully gray, and is a pretty young man, and dies fairly early, and I think it's of a heart attack. I think we have to imagine what that did to his body over time, right? And so to ask students to desegregate these spaces, that's kind of a big thing to ask, and to then imagine what are they coming into. So I think that for those reasons, probably a combination. There's nothing concrete, though, that I found that says like there was a decision to say no black students at all.
By the way, I'm one of those rare people. I grew up in Joliet. I lived on the west side, 2 blocks from the cornfields, but left after college. And I'm new to Lake Forest. I've only lived here 39 years. But what's that?
You are definitely a newbie.
A newbie, that's right, yeah. And I behave that way. I'm very careful. But here's my question. What was the economic status of African Americans in Lake Forest compared to in Joliet?
Well, I think at the beginning, the same. I think that both of them came up looking for work. I mean, one of the things that we know for Lake Forest was that you have these grand estates that are being built. And, a lot of these folks were new into their wealth. The Armours, the McCormicks, like they weren't inherited funds, they were building an empire, and they didn't know how to run an estate, but there was a whole group of people newly out of work out of the South that did know, and so they brought, Lake Forest is settled by people who are very abolitionist friendly, if not actually active abolitionists. And they make the decision to walk the walk, and they make an outreach to the South that basically says, if you are coming out of slavery, we have opportunities for you. And they did bring folks up to work in the houses. So the gardeners, the housekeepers, the livery drivers, a lot of these folks with skills that they had unfortunately developed during slavery, they come up here and they actually find these opportunities. They live on the land. I think the same thing happens in Joliet as people come up because industry is really starting to build up, and I'll let Dennis talk a little about early Joliet.
Yeah, I think well, I'm kind of jumping ahead. I mean, early Joliet, people are coming in, and it has more of an industrial feel, right? Decidedly. But the other thing is thinking about the redlining that goes on in Joliet. But redlining only takes into account home ownership, right? And so what it doesn't capture is the segregation that's going on, that is kind of cultural, that it's harder to document as a result. One of the things I was happy about with the banner exhibit was the graphic designer who put the institutions on the map. And the overlay is the red line districts. And so that you can see how that plays out over time.
I kind of have like two questions, one related to the other. The first one being, so we know that there was redlining in Joliet and especially in like the surrounding areas like Chicago, but did Lake Forest kind of have its own version of that where there was kind of like a neighborhood where mostly black people lived? And then to kind of follow that to the present day, is that community still very like active and present in Lake Forest? Because like I'm an outsider, but my mom is also a graduate from Lake Forest, and she mentioned there being a very strong black community when she was here in like the 80s. And I've come up here, and I've only been to town a few times, but I haven't really noticed it. And I just want to know if maybe that's just pure coincidence, or if maybe there's been kind of a dwindling of that population.
Yes, there has definitely been a dwindling of that population, and that has been going on for probably about, well, a lot of years. Yeah, a lot of years.
It really starts to plateau in the 40s, and you see the growth of the white population around the 60s, but the black population remains pretty consistent.
Now, there were also pockets at the time. We talked about like the south end of the college, the south end of town, Illinois Road, Washington. There were areas, Spruce Avenue. There were areas where the African Americans seemed to cluster at the time. Originally, they were downtown, across from the train depot where the banks are, and they were kind of forced to move. So these are the other areas that they sprung up in. Lovely residential areas. Though looking at the display in the other room, you can see that there was a type of redlining that was going on as far as whether or not they were considered desirable. And in a large part, they were not, because there were, I think we were colored then. There were colored people living there, Negroes. There were Negroes living there, so it wasn't a desirable area. That has also flipped. If you go into those same neighborhoods now, if the houses are still there, and many of the homes have been torn down and something else built, you are going to really have to look to try to find African Americans in those same areas. They're not the same pockets and clusters that there used to be, and that could be a good thing and it could be a bad thing. The people that are here are kind of spread out. The new people are certainly spread out, and most of the old timers, if you will, sorry Debbie, most of the old timers have moved away because whatever it is that they were looking for did not necessarily exist in Lake Forest. They may have loved their time here, but perhaps opportunity-wise, as far as whatever their career decisions were, they didn't have those here. And that's true for a lot of the population, not just African American, because Lake Forest itself does not have industry. Our industry is either wealth or real estate. That's about it. Banking. Those are the things that we have here. So people had to move in order to pursue those things.
So kind of going off of that, I may have misheard you, but I think you mentioned that around the 80s there was an increase in the black population in the college, but a decrease in the black population in the town. If there was the decrease in the town, I'm wondering why you think that was or what contributed to that.
So, yeah, a big part of that was money. The other part of it, so one of the things as we sort of look at this history coming out of the 1940s and 1950s, as you start to see this effort to become a much more upper class community, they go in the 1950s, they pass a law that says it has to be an acre of land. I think in 1972, it's 4 acres of land that you have to, if you're going to put in a new house, you're putting it on 4 acres of land. So what happens is you just start to really reduce the number of people who have access to Lake Forest. One of the things that we know out of our study of the families from the 1920s and 1930s is, these kids are going on to college, and then their kids are going on to terminal degrees. They're becoming judges and lawyers and professors and doctors, and they are leaving to go find jobs, and that continues well into the 1970s. But the other thing, again, anecdotally, we get stories that by 1960, you start to see sort of verbal restrictions around who can buy a home, right? So I can put my house on the market, and there's just an understanding that that real estate agent is not going to sell that to somebody who is of color. And there's, again, no documented trail. By the way, if you want a really interesting comparison, when the Glencoe folks come talk, Glencoe is a really interesting model. It's the other very large African-American community along the North Shore before Waukegan until 1930. In 1930, Frank Lloyd Wright's lawyer moves up there and decides he is going after every African-American home and Italians, just for bonus. And he has 90% of the homes condemned and knocked down over the course of a decade. He documents everything, because when you're that racist, you want to put that on paper. Yeah, proud. And he takes the population from 10% to 1% in 10 years. Oh, it's now 4? Yeah. It's amazing. Like, again, the arrogance of that and the documentation of that. After the First World War. So there's some discussion, too, about the influence the wars have on where the populations reside. But it is clear Lake Forest changes in the 1960s and becomes more restrictive. And again, it's not as rigid and defined as some of the other communities were, but it's definitely there. And one of the things I know from some of the conversations with some of the professors some of the black professors who were getting hired, was that living in Lake Forest was going to be a challenge. Their ability to buy a house was going to be a challenge. So we don't want to paint this with rose-colored glasses and say it was all, grand and glorious and yay us utopia. It was not. But what's interesting is those early years, particularly compared to a community that was highly segregated, and the trajectory that it creates for the families who live there, how different that experience is.
Carol, Dennis, Courtney, Sue, and Morgan Jennings, everybody. Thank you for such an insightful conversation regarding this town's history and Joliet's history. So as I mentioned, this presentation and exhibition opening is a part of our current exhibition available in the other side of the building, Deeply Rooted and Rising High, African American Experiences in Lake Forest. That's going to be available through November 16th is the last day to see that exhibit. Once again, Carol, Dennis, Morgan, Courtney, and Sue, thank you for such an insightful presentation, and thank you all for attending this evening.